Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. We've still got people joining us at a rapid pace. Thanks for being with us today. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Goldstone. I oversee Woodwell Climate Research Center's communications activities, and I am thrilled to be your host and moderator today for this event. And on behalf of Woodwell Climate Research Center and our partners in convening these events, I want to say thank you. We are so grateful to have you here for the culmination of this really exciting series, delving into the power of climate risk data and analytics to inform policymakers and advocates and communities and planners in efforts to build resilient systems and protect our communities from climate change. So thank you so much. I do want to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge the tragic and frightening situation in Ukraine. And the attention that it is rightfully demanding at this moment. However, as we have also seen over the past 2 years with a global pandemic, climate change does not pause for each new crisis that arises. And in fact, these crises can present inflection points and moments where the choices that we make in response to that individual crisis could either accelerate or derail critically important efforts to address climate change. And so it remains important that we keep our eyes on the goal, that we sustain our efforts to address climate change. And I think the latest report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released just yesterday, makes this case quite forcefully. And I'll just read the last brief paragraph from the summary for policymakers. Quote, "The cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and to planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all." And in the technical language of the IPCC, that statement is attributed very high confidence. So it is with that we turn our attention today to the urgent matter of mustering climate risk information in support of communities across our country that are striving for resilience and for justice. And we have an amazing group of experts and perspectives here with us today. So let me start by giving you a little bit of a brief roadmap for today's conversation and today's event. We're first going to hear from Joe Kennedy III, a Woodwell board member, who I'll introduce in just one second. After Joe, we will hear from Heather Mcteer Toney, providing our keynote address for today. And then after Heather, we will turn to our panel of experts who are really on the front lines dealing with climate change on the ground in a variety of different communities. And then because this is the final event in this 3-part series, this event will run a bit longer than the others, and we will end today with some closing remarks and takeaways from 2 advocates working on these issues day in and day out in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. We are also offering CLE credit. If you are interested and that makes sense to you, please listen for the code, which we will provide during the panel. So with that, those housekeeping notes, it is now my pleasure to introduce Joe Kennedy III. He's a lawyer and politician who has served as the U.S. representative for Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District from 2013 to 2021. He's a member of the Democratic Party and represented a district that extends from Boston's western suburbs to the state's south coast. He worked as an assistant district attorney in the Cape and Islands and Middlesex County, Massachusetts offices before his election to Congress. And in January 2021, he became a CNN commentator. He also serves as a board member for Woodwell Climate Research Center, and he graduated from Harvard Law School. So Joe, over to you.
Heather, thank you very, very much. And thank you for the invitation to be with all of you in this incredibly distinguished panel. I'm excited to listen and learn to all of you. I thought I'd just begin with a little bit of my experience dealing with some of these issues as a member of Congress. About 10 years ago, I hadn't been in Congress for very long, but I remember visiting some executives at a major insurance company. They walked me through their top asks for policymakers that year. And I was heartened and candidly a bit surprised to see that right after the renewal of terrorism risk insurance, the company was asking for progress on climate policy. I didn't realize that this was an issue that had taken over the C-suite on Wall Street quite yet. One of the executives gave me the answer I probably should have expected. They were on the hook for insurance claims. It's business that happened to be good for the planet. That meeting stuck with me for a lot of reasons. There are few fields that can fog up that rose-colored tint in one's glasses more quickly than politics. But it also struck me that if these guys knew that it was good for business, then plenty of other people should too. That opportunity was based in large part on data, what climate change actually means, the cost of inaction, the risk of insufficient adaptation and resilience, and the value of the investment in prevention and mitigation. Getting more reliable data out to everyone ought to be something that government should support and accelerate now more than ever, because we literally have run out of time. My in-laws relocated to Houston, Texas about 10 years ago. I remember calling them during Hurricane Harvey to check in on the days that the storm was wreaking havoc on the city and in the weeks afterwards. As many of you will recall, the storm dropped some 60 inches of rain in the city in a matter of days. Somehow, their street corner didn't flood, but homes a few blocks away were underwater. I went on a congressional visit about 2 weeks after the storm. You all have seen some of these photos. Block after block of homes who had their entire contents ripped out and placed on their front lawn. There was no place else to put it. But I couldn't fathom how any truck could come along and pick up what seemed to be just literally block after block of an entire community. Mattresses, curtains, rugs, floors, drywall, stuffed animals, keepsakes, and quilts. The things that make a house your home, stacked in piles to somehow get to a dump. We all know it's only getting worse. According to a recent report by NOAA, the number of billion-dollar storms continues to rise. This decade is on pace to be the most expensive ever, with over 86 storms in the past 5 years, eclipsing $1 billion in damages. Keep in mind that in the 1980s, there were only 29 total. To make that point even more explicit, as Heather just referenced, the IPCC released their report yesterday. It was a warning that many of us knew was coming, but was still stunning to read. The report states that, quote, climate change risks to cities, settlements, and key infrastructure will rise rapidly in the mid and long term with further global warming, especially in places already exposed to high temperatures, along coastlines, or with high vulnerabilities. Projected estimates of global aggregate net economic damages generally increase non-linearly with global warming levels, end quote. The New York Times, in their analysis of the report, indicates that if temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, quote, roughly 8% of the world's farmland can become unsuitable for growing food. Coral reefs, which buffer coastlines against storms and sustain fisheries for millions of people, will face far more frequent bleaching from ocean heat waves and decline by 70 to 90%. The number of people around the world exposed to severe coastal flooding could increase by more than 1/5 without new protections. End quote. And of course, poor communities and poor countries and marginalized communities will bear the disproportionate brunt of this impact. Almost everyone who understands the climate crisis understands this. Yet we as a society are still struggling to respond adequately to the challenge. And yes, we need more data, collected, analyzed, interpreted, published, so that policymakers and civil society leaders can understand what to do with it and how to prepare our communities. But if we want data to inform decision-making, we need to use it to inform public opinion as well. One of the most contentious meetings I ever had as a member of Congress was with a middle-class community in my district outside of Boston. Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, was in the process of publishing their updated flood maps, and families were stunned to learn that they were at risk of flooding. They were going to be required to purchase insurance that they could not afford or sell their home at a devastating discount because the new buyer would have to purchase that same insurance. These are families who worked hard their entire lives and felt like the federal government had just gutted their life savings off a hypothetical scenario that had yet to occur. And they were livid. Now, no flood map perhaps can ever be perfect. There's assumptions and estimates in any type of prediction. However, the issue there wasn't the accuracy of the new maps. It's that we didn't have those maps when those folks bought their homes 30 years beforehand. Forcing those families to accept that loss was also unacceptable. Indeed, Congress passed a law alleviating that burden, putting it back on the taxpayer, knowing full well that more multi-billion-dollar storms are just around the corner. Clearly, this doesn't solve the problem, but that's where this panel comes in, where I'm so proud of the work that Woodwell and all of these panels are doing, because policymakers are desperate for good data. That data has to form the foundation of a narrative, but what we have to lose and what we can achieve. And it has to solve not only for the risks of inaction, for how we're going to help communities to confront what is coming in a way that they can understand and afford. Few institutions are as focused on studying the system impact of climate change as Woodwell has been. Their focus on risk and resiliency is helping to lead the discussion amongst policymakers about where and how we need to focus our response. You've heard about their efforts and those of other leading advocates in this crucial speaker series. And I know that they'll continue to push decision makers to focus on equity and justice as they help craft a collective response. Our next speaker, she has some thoughts on what's working and what's not as we plot our pathway forward. I'm looking forward to hearing Heather and learning from our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. And it is indeed my pleasure to now introduce our next speaker, Heather Mcteer Toney. She is currently Vice President of Community Engagement at the Environmental Defense Fund. She served as the first African-American, first female, and youngest mayor of Greenville, Missouri. And in 2014, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast region, where she served until 2017. Known for her energetic and genuine commitment to people, her work has made her a national figure in public service, diversity, and community engagement. Heather led the Moms Clean Air Clean Air Force field team for 2 years, worked on local government policy initiatives and the Moms and Mayors program. She holds a bachelor's degree from Spelman College in Atlanta and a law degree from Tulane University School of Law. And we are so thankful to have you here today, Heather, to take this next step in our discussion.
Thanks so much, Heather. And hello, thank you to each of you for taking the time today to participate and listen to this very important discussion. I am coming to you from Oxford, Mississippi. I'm born and raised and former mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Cherokee and the Chickasaw people. I've had a lot of titles in my life, but my favorite title is mom, and to my husband, it's babe. Those titles meant a lot to me as over the past week I've watched and we've experienced a cross section of occurrences that indicate we're really at a crossroads of change in our society. In the United States, the president has nominated the first African-American woman to sit on the United States Supreme Court. At the same time, our administration released a tool that removes race from the equation of environmental justice, and many, many justice leaders are very concerned. From the fight for democracy in the Ukraine to the impacts of cryptocurrency mining, all of these issues are not only influenced and impacted by our climate, but also how we respond. And what we have to understand is that climate change, climate crisis, environmental justice, all of these are intersectional. And adaptation and resiliency is now a part of our life, whether we like it or not. This past week, earlier, we had a hard freeze come through Mississippi. And when you have a hard freeze come through, it's exactly that. It's a hard freeze. Immediately, the temperature drops, and most folks go and they turn their spigots on just a little bit to keep the water running so that the pipes don't freeze. I went outside to our water hose in the back, and when it began to thaw out, I turned on the spigot to rinse something, but there was no water that came out from the water hose. As I felt the water hose, I realized that the water inside had frozen. And it took it a little while, but chunks of ice began coming out of this water hose. And it reminded me of the same thing that we're experiencing right now when we think about the impacts and how we have to become resilient and adapt to what happens with climate. We can turn off the spigot of pollution in our community and putting pollution into the air, but it does not resolve us or absolve us from the pollution that is currently in the system and where it goes and what it has to do. What our responsibility is, and to ensure that it is not focused in one solid area, like I did when I let the water and the ice pour out into one hole in my yard. You create a sacrifice zone. And everything in that area becomes inundated with the pollution that's poured out to one particular area so that the others are saved. We cannot do that, not in our country, not on our planet, not knowing that we have brothers and sisters around the world that are depending upon us to have a collaborative solution to climate. It's through that lens that we have to think through mitigating the risk of climate change through a lens of justice, equity, and with a real eye towards the future. We can talk regulation all day, but without enforcement, it's not sustainable. Without connection and community-driven solutions, and without proper planning, we don't have a way to really deploy and ensure that the solutions we come up with actually last and are efficient and are scalable to ensure that we have a solid future. That's why communities have to be empowered to push forward community-driven solutions. It's why we have to listen and truly think of doing something different. Now, this is not new to us. What's unfortunate is that the warnings we've all shared and heard over the past 10 years at a minimum have not been heeded. When we really think to the lessons and words of wisdom that have come from all parts of our planet, from the frontline indigenous communities that have truly been living climate change and climate crisis for generations, to the scientists in different countries that have shared or tried to share their experiences and what is truly necessary in order to protect our communities, to the underserved populations right here in the United States of America that rely on a collaborative effort of local government, of business and community to just do the right thing and enforce the rules. We don't need forecasts to calculate the climate risks that's posed because we're experiencing and living it each and every day. Right now, today, we're experiencing in real time the devastation, physical and financial loss that's borne by those most unable to stand the burden due to failures of adequate preparation or listening to the forecast or trusting the science. More often than not, the brunt of these expenses fall on communities that are most at risk to the impact of climate change, communities of color and economically depressed regions. So understanding these risks is a necessity for more than just markets and investors. It's critical for the people who are also identified as the places in which some of these corporations and their assets sit, and the communities in which people live where those assets also suffer loss. When I was mayor of Greenville, I was blessed with a really cool and great corporate partner, Mars Food. They had operated what was then known as Uncle Ben's Rice. It's now Uncle Ben's Original Rice in Greenville, Mississippi for over 40 years. And they not only supplied needed jobs to the community, but they also held an important role as a major public asset. They occupied over 80 acres, 250,000 square feet, and produced over 100,000 tons of rice annually, the largest factory in the world. And it was anchored right on the Mississippi River to a majority African-American community that had worked so hard to overcome systemic poverty for generations. But during my time of public service, I had to manage not one, but two 500-year flood events. And both events caused extensive and expensive damage to the infrastructure of the community, the roads, the bridges, the water systems. Here's why collaboration is so important and why I think they were a great partner. Number one, they had a climate sustainability plan, and they had already taken into account the asset placements, the needs, the preparation, the mitigation that was necessary to continue strong global economic growth, while at the same time supporting local community needs. But they had a willingness to share information, to talk about those impacts, and even how the community, their employees, the environment would be impacted. So their full collaborative support, working alongside community, the space where they lived, it meant that we were able to assess what street grade upgrades cost, police and fire in case of an emergency, water system points of weakness, potential levee breaches. All of these things are things that both add value to the business, but also look at the protection of the community. And this is what we have to do. This is why collaboration is so important at this particular moment, because as we listen to these reports that continue to pour forward, we know that the water in that pipe, it's not going anywhere. We can't put the pollution back. We have to deal with what is coming into our communities right now today. And look at how government, corporation, and communities can respond. That's going to tell us whether or not we've learned from our history. It's going to tell us whether or not I can talk to my children about this moment of transformational change and us truly listening to the science, but also to the community experts in order to create a more efficient and equitable process that saves our economy, our ecosystems, and our lives at the same time. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Heather. Wow. Well, so already so much that we've gotten from our two speakers, and I'm now thrilled to be able to very briefly introduce our panelists. We do have full bios for all of our panelists in a brochure that is being shared in the chat, but for the sake of our time here together today, I will keep it very brief. Joining me today on our panel, we have Robin Bronin, who is Executive Director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. We have Joyce Coffey, who is the founder and president of Climate Resilience Consulting. We have Jennifer Gerardo, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for Broward County, Florida. And we have Effie Turnbull Sanders, who is the Environmental Justice Commissioner for the California Coastal Commission, an incredible panel of experts and practitioners representing a real diversity of communities across the country, and where I'd like to start this conversation is just grounding us in each of those communities and the challenges that they face. And I guess I'll start with you, Robin. And I know you had a slide you wanted to share that hits at some of this. Tell us what the communities that you work with, who they are and what it is they're facing in this realm.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I live in Alaska, and as hopefully most of you know, the Arctic is warming 3 times as fast as the lower latitudes, and that is having a devastating impact on the Alaska Native Indigenous communities that my agency works with, which are primarily located along the western coast of Alaska. And what's really important to understand is how much the Arctic is changing, and it is driving the change for the lower latitudes. So in the Arctic, we have lost an enormous amount of Arctic sea ice. And while that is critically important for the rest of the planet in regard to our planet's ability to cool, what that has done for Western Alaska Native communities, it has removed the barrier that has normally protected communities from the coastal storms that come in. We don't yet have hurricanes in Alaska, but we do have hurricane strength winds. And without that Arctic sea ice, those storms are now causing accelerated rates of erosion, which you can see on the slide that I shared. And through our work with the Alaska Native communities, we identified a new hazard in our state, and it's called Ushtek. It's a Yupik word, and it means catastrophic land collapse, which is being caused by the combination of thawing permafrost, accelerating rates of erosion, and flooding. And it's because of catastrophic land collapse that several Alaska Native communities are now faced with the awful decision. And I always use the word awful because they are being faced with the need to make a decision about where they're going to move their entire community, because the land on which they live and maintain livelihoods is rapidly becoming uninhabitable. There are 3 Alaska Native communities that have been trying to relocate since the 1990s, and none of them have yet relocated. 2 of them are actually in a relocation process. Newtok, Alaska is the community that has been in the longest relocation process. And back in 2007, federal and state government agencies recognized that the community needed to relocate. There was no contention about it. The tribe had voted to relocate. They found a relocation site, and everybody agreed that the community had to relocate by 2012 at the latest, or face a humanitarian crisis. And it's now a decade past 2012. A third of the community has gotten to their relocation site. 2/3 of the community, about 300 people, remain in their original location at devastating consequence to their public health. And so the work that we're doing in the Alaska Institute for Justice is making sure, one, that self-determination is protected, tribal self-determination is protected, and that community tribes are figuring out what we call a relocation governance process can look like that protects their individual and collective human rights.
Wow, Robin, thank you so much for that powerful description of what coastal communities in Alaska are facing right now. I want to turn to very different coastal communities, and that's Jennifer, to you with Broward County, Florida. Jennifer, I'm not, I see your slide, but I'm not hearing you.
Now you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I appreciate the invitation to be here today and to contribute to the conversation and paint a picture that probably quite distinct in terms of setting, but very similar in terms of the severity of challenges that Robin shared. This is just a quick image of the landscape here in Broward County. Not all of our community here in Southeast Florida sits on the waterfront, but this flat, very low-lying landscape that's very exposed to slight changes in water elevations is pretty consistent with our entire community's geographic area. We have a very coastal, highly developed landscape, no open space for retreat. It's all urbanized except where we're sandwiched very narrowly between the Atlantic Ocean to our east and the Everglades natural area to the west, with a community of nearly 2 million and 31 cities. So again, very highly urban, exposed to rising seas, storm surge, very intense rainfall. We have historically received about 58 inches of rainfall per year. We're looking at very significant rainfall intensification of about 20% for some of our more sizable rainfall events. And here's some examples of some of the challenges our community has been faced with. You know, more than a decade ago, we were hearing more and more about the challenges of high tide flooding. It happened, I would say nearly 2012 is when we started hearing more predictably about the seasonal high tides and the flooding that would be generated. This is incredibly problematic, where we've had incongruencies in infrastructure. And so you can have a high spot and a low spot, and no matter that one individual might have improved part of, say, their seawall or a roadway to create a barrier to floodwaters, here it's coming over seawalls, it's coming up through stormwater management systems, you know, culverts, drainage culverts. And this type of saltwater flooding, while it might have the perception, and I'm pointing more to the figure on the left, as being kind of the rich man's problem or the rich woman's problem, the fact is the drainage across our entire community relies upon gravity and the ability to discharge all the inland areas to the west, to the coastal areas. And so you can actually have impacts of high tide flooding that are occurring many miles inland for communities that have no direct access to any waterway, and yet they're seeing the effects of these high tides. So this example of the image in the middle from Melrose Park, this came when we received about 30 inches of rainfall in a 5-week time period. About 24 of those inches came in a single day. And the flood event was sandwiched by high tides on both sides. And so the groundwater table was already high, it was super saturated, and the water couldn't move. We had communities that were flooded for 2 weeks, largely influenced by the inability to drain because of these extreme high tides and the rise in sea level that's compromising a drainage system that's been in place for 60 years and is largely unaltered. And the picture on the far right, this was another very intense rainfall event, 18 inches in just over a day. It shut down one of the most significant economic commercial sites in our county at a loss of $30 million in revenue in 3 days, just because there wasn't parking. And that didn't even relate to any like infrastructure impacts. It was just issues of accessibility. So it really underscores the navigational challenges, whether you're trying to get to work, take your children to school, get to the medical, facilities. These are community-wide disruptions. And so what it has done has really led to an organization for ourselves in terms of how do we begin to rework what's required for infrastructure planning in our community. So we've undertaken a stepwise process. We've begun to model higher water levels into future land use planning. We now have resilience criteria that are signed to land use project reviews and the basis for support or not by our elected leadership. But we've also adopted a formal sea level rise projection or scenarios for planning. And that's been very significant because it's not just a scenario, but it's the integration of that scenario into our regulatory processes. And so just very quickly, some examples of that. We amended our drainage requirements for surface water management systems and other French drains and other retention areas in order to account for the rise in water table that's happening across our eastern parts of the community. So today, all of those systems have to be designed with a future condition of 2 feet of sea level rise, which at the time equated to about a 50-year time frame. We then implemented consistent seawall standards and tidal flood barriers across all of our coastal municipalities. And in fact, it's now the deadline, the month of March, where we gave the communities 2 years to implement this standard. It's tied to the land use plan. It's part of the county ordinances. And in this case, we can see how a marina had previously, because of its very low elevation, served as a funnel. This is actually a pretty unimpactful image. You could actually kayak in the stream of water at one point, completely inundating the neighborhoods on the backside. So we worked with the city to help them come up to the standard that was being developed in the process. Grants were involved, and we saw a complete rectification of that marina. So it's no longer a source of flooding, but it provides example how infrastructure funding, even nominal projects, can have dramatic improvements for community livability and property values where we're concerned about the tax base. The next part of our planning has really looked at the prediction and the compound flooding. And I would think that this is one of the most significant challenges for communities. How do you look at the effects of rising water table, increased rainfall, and impacts on, say, stormwater management because of sea level rise on what are your flood elevations, 100-year or 500-year, as was referenced by that Heather. And we have just completed a modeling exercise where we've evaluated that combination of factors and have established new finished floor elevations for all development and major redevelopment. And the image on the left gives example that in this case of redevelopment, the lines rising from the bottom to the top show how flood elevations have increased with time. And today, for every foot below FEMA flood elevation, you can count on the insurance rate about doubling. So it's very significant that we plan for what is this ever evolving flood elevation while we also try to keep water at bay. And so that brings us to the last part of the plan. And I think some of the questions as you look at issues of economics and challenged communities, this is all fine for redevelopment and new development, but what about this community that's already in place that constitutes this 1.9 million? So we're now working to bring all of those modeling tools and efforts and the climate science to a countywide resilience plan that will help inform organized capital investment and redevelopment strategies. So that's kind of where we've been as a community and the large task that sits before us while we deal with the greater risk of not just flood risk, but heat and so many other factors that we care about. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. A whirlwind tour of a lot of work going on in Broward County. Effie, I want to turn to you next, and yet another kind of iteration of the challenges facing coastal communities, this time in California.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today. I primarily represent California, and California coastal communities are of importance in our regulatory process. I think in thinking about climate resilience, I think in California, we really have to take a step back and think about the history of land use and how we got here. So looking at the original sin of our nation in forced removal and genocide against indigenous peoples, and then continuing through urban renewal and thinking about how freeways were planted in the points of least resistance, as Heather mentioned, the most vulnerable communities, where the most vulnerable communities suffer from disproportionate impacts of air pollution, urban heat island effect, high urban temperatures, and maybe don't have access to relief that the California coast provides. And so as we think about planning for resilience in the future, I think we really have to think about what communities are most vulnerable and how do we protect those communities. So I think thinking of resilience also in terms of cultural resilience and inclusion, and thinking about how do we do things differently. So as demographics shift and we start thinking about the next generation of environmental protectors, how do we start doing that in a better way? So I'm going to just share my screen here with a little model of the Coastal Commission piece. I'll do that on the next slide. But I'm the Environmental Justice Commissioner for the California Coastal Commission. In 2018, we adopted an environmental justice policy. That policy works in tandem with local communities to address things, as Jennifer mentioned, like sea level rise and sea level inundation. But one of the most important pieces is how do we protect communities and give them access to the coast to find that relief from the high level temperatures? How do we provide opportunities for folks to recreate at the beach? In California, we have a very segregated kind of landscape in terms of our land use practices. And you don't find as many folks of color owning property along the beaches. And so how do we protect those folks so that they do have that access? And one way to do it is thinking about how do we plan to eliminate seawalls that cut off public access? How do we promote public education programs that give that access in a different way? And how do we work with our local jurisdictions to plan in their local coastal programs for both sea level rise and to provide that access going forward?
Effie, we're not seeing your screen if you're sharing at this moment. So
yes, and I'm having a little difficulty here seeing the share screen button in my view. So I think that we'll just pass on that to the next question if I'm able to figure that out. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So Joyce, you're in a little bit of a different role or position. But talk to us a little bit about the communities that you work with, and when someone comes to you and your consulting group, what is it they're in need of at this point?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that they're in need of is to be listened to and to be really heard. And then to have, if I'm arriving as a white leader, someone who is absolutely a person of white privilege, and someone who has throughout my career probably been a part of white supremacy, which is something I haven't heard from other white members of our panel today, but is absolutely part of our history and our current. The first thing is to listen. And often what I will hear is what the numbers actually show. And that is that resilience is not fair. Climate risk is not fair. Disaster recovery is not fair. And that all of these systems of dealing with climate change solutions are actually furthering injustice. So what I mean, for instance, is that we have seen an estimated increase in the white-black wealth gap in the last 20 years attributed to natural disasters. FEMA funds make wealthy people, white college-educated people, wealthier after an extreme event, and they make poorer people, Black high school educated people, poorer, to the tune of about $150,000 poorer for the Black community and more than $200,000 richer for the white household. Now, this is not just around disaster recovery. We see that the data suggests that there will be cumulative property damage much greater in poorer communities than there are in wealthy ones, and that many poorer communities will be faced with the extraordinary lack of choice that Holly's presentation reminded us about. And so as a white leader, I've already mentioned that one very important key element of my work is to listen carefully. And I know we're talking here about data. And so part of listening carefully is to hear what data matters to the communities that we serve. And I often try to work around 5 principles for centering racial justice, especially racial justice in the United States, in the work of climate resilience, to try to turn the tide of some of those problems that I mentioned earlier. And the number one is to focus on root causes. the original sin that Effie mentioned, and the ongoing historic and current systemic racism in all of our systems. The second is to institutionalize representation, which often means that I leave the room, or in any case, I'm not at the front of the room, so that those who are leaders, who are affected, who have the solutions, can actually have the power. Of course, that also relates to the number 3, which is co-owning planning efforts with communities. This is not the federal government planning for a community, supposedly, or a powerful environmental nonprofit saying what communities need. It is, in fact, having communities say what they want and need and how they think they should get it. Certainly then, lastly, close to lastly, centering equity in data collection and analysis really means acknowledging implicit bias in current data collection and also in what data we're choosing to privilege. I was struck by, Heather, you pointing out what the IPCC policy framework mentioned, that, that if we continue in this way, livelihoods will be impacted. That's as if that's going to happen in the future. But what we've heard from Jennifer and from others is that it's happening already, and we owe it to ourselves as moral people and as leaders with power to make sure that equity-based data is centered. Just a brief anecdote that when I came to a city in Florida with peril data, that is data about hazards, the chief resilience officer was so profound. She said to me, I don't want to hear it. This just means that you're essentially saying that my most resilient communities are seemingly more vulnerable. That's not fair, and it's not good policy. So we changed the dialogue there to ensure that we were talking first about the resilience of these communities, second about what local government was going to do to actually further that resilience with a reallocation of resources, and third about hazard data that showed disproportionate impact, yes, indeed, greater vulnerability for BIPOC communities. And lastly, of course, facilitating cross-sector collaboration is crucial. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Joyce, you really hit on something there. And Jennifer, you were walking us through this as well. The importance of community-led efforts and the role of information, the type of information, how that information is gathered, how it's used in furthering community-led efforts. I want to go back to Effie and to Robin and just kind of open that up and say, okay, so what is the role of information and how does that become part of a community-led effort? Effie, do you want to start us off there and then we'll go back to Robin?
Sure. I mean, I think we really have to get, wearing my other hat at the University of Southern California, one of the things that we're working on as an anchor institution is how do we engage community in community-based participatory research programs so that we are not going into communities and studying them as objects, but we are actually working with them to identify problems that they want to find solutions to, and working with them in gathering that information in a culturally sensitive way. One of the things that we have in California is something called the Enviro Screen, and it is a tool that is used to be able to determine what are the economic and also environmental burdens on particular communities so that we can identify those particular communities that are most burdened. One of the things that we have also is a program that gives grants through our state government, through our cap and trade program, to communities that rate highest on that California Enviro Screen to start building more equity. And so I think that looking at models and modeling tools that really identify community groups and communities that are most impacted and prioritizing the spending in those communities, because without prioritizing the resources, we are doomed to perpetuate the status quo and impact communities in a negative way, as was previously mentioned.
Thank you. And Robin, yeah, over to you in terms of community-led efforts. Obviously, based just on your brief presentation, communities on the west coast of Alaska are very aware of the risks they face. What is the role of risk information or new research in enabling community-led adaptation efforts?
Yeah, so the heart of the work that we do is on community-based environmental monitoring. So when we started our work with the tribes now 8 years ago, we sent letters. So the federal government has been well aware of the climate crisis and its impact on Indigenous communities in Alaska. And back in 2009, the U.S. Government Accountability Office did a report saying that there were 31 Alaska Native communities that were imminently threatened by flooding and erosion. So we wrote to those communities and we asked them if they wanted to work with us to monitor the environmental changes that they were concerned about. And 15 communities responded that they wanted to work with us. And so in those communities, we worked with the tribes to begin what we call community-based environmental monitoring of erosion, flooding, and thawing permafrost. And the reason why that is so important in regard to the community monitoring and gathering the data, there are several reasons, but one is outside consultants coming into communities can never capture the full information about what is happening. And what I often say is the climate crisis is going to be with us for millennia. And if we don't create systems now that can capture the rapidly changing environment that we are each living in, then we are not going to be able to adapt and respond. So one of the critical pieces in doing the community-based erosion and permafrost thaw monitoring was to connect tribes with outside experts who could then work with the tribes so that they would have an understanding of the predicted rate of change for things like erosion and permafrost thaw. And with flooding, what we learned is, so Alaska is a really remote place. There's almost no roads in our entire state. And so in the western part of Alaska, what we noticed is our state government would often declare disasters for those storms that I previously mentioned, for these large areas where there would be maybe 20 tribes within that area. But then there were only 2 that were documenting the damages from those storms. And so we started working with the National Weather Service to get better forecast information for the tribes. And then we worked with the tribes to document how the flooding was impacting their community. And then we sent it out to state and federal government agencies, because what was critical was for the tribes to get access to the resources that they need. And it's through this work, the integration of Indigenous science and natural sciences, that they came up with the understanding that Ushtek was happening and that it was catastrophic land collapse, not erosion. Because when we think of erosion, we think of this slow ongoing process where you have maybe a few inches of land loss. And what's happening in Alaska is we get tens of feet. So 70 feet of land could be gone in a storm. And so it was critical to document that and to understand the changes that were being caused by the climate crisis that are just going to continue to accelerate.
For those of you who have joined us today and are hoping to receive CLE credit, I want to announce our CLE code word. It is resilience, which is, of course, appropriate to today's conversation. Springboarding off what you were just saying, Robin, I wonder if we could kind of go to each of you, and you've each touched on this, but let's maybe spell it out. Is there, in your experience, a formula for success in the roles of communities, local, state, federal government, and private entities? Or perhaps on the flip side of that, have you experienced when it's all gone wrong? What are the things to avoid in how we, because obviously as you're all saying, we have to muster all of these entities in order to address these challenges. So either what have you seen work, or what have you seen really not work that should be avoided? Robin, go ahead and
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if that was directed to me. So what's worked is the community-based environmental monitoring. That has transformed the way mostly outside agencies understand what's happening within communities. And they've, as you've said, they've known for decades what is happening. And the challenge has been that they haven't been listened to, as Joyce mentioned. And so the heart of the work that we do is this collaboration, because it takes both. It takes the Indigenous knowledge and the access to the ability to model that, to understand the predictive rate of change, so that the tribal governments can make these decisions about how to adapt.
Jennifer, I see you've got your hand up, so we'll go to you next, and then to Effie and to Joyce.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to be brief. One, I want to say that we've worked with the business leadership now for about 5 years. We had not initially focused on economic resilience as a large part of our conversation. Being able to talk about risks, exposure, relationship to financial markets has really brought in a windfall of private sector engagement in the conversation. That's been critical, because we would not have been successful with the future conditions standards had we not had the business and development community comfortable with and knowledgeable with regards to those recommendations. I want to say being able to talk about the economics associated with those investments has been important. Being able to demonstrate that you can still develop with resilient standards and make the project viable. And we went through those types of analyses. We undertook a business case for resilience involving financial cost share by the business community and by the partners in our 4-county collaborative on climate. Being able to have some numerics that stand behind the return on investment when you organize in that way has really been pivotal in our conversation and in justifying now the larger regional plan. And then finally, I think we have a lot of community platforms where we bring together principally leadership through large convenings, but we've also organized a county-wide resilience dashboard, which is online and serves as the landing pad for the resilience initiatives, the need for those plans, what those investments look like, what types of projects are underway across communities. And it allows, a resident in one community to say, well, why isn't my community doing more? Or why is this neighborhood receiving this benefit and we're not? Or why isn't the flooding in our community documented on this page? So I think it's very powerful in making the information accessible and revealing. We've got crowdsourced information to self-report, as well as other tools to help self-evaluate personal flood risk under current and evolving conditions. So really proud of that last investment. And those are some of the things that have worked for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Effie, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I'll just share my screen here finally. And I think one of the things that has worked for us is to really look at our environmental justice policy from a comprehensive focus, and think about how do we think about the intersectionality of our work, and how do we bring in community groups and community members so that we don't have a top-down approach to coastal protection. So looking at the implementation of our environmental justice policy, integrating that within our 5-year strategic plan, and then also having racial and equity training to help support our staff in their efforts to help the most vulnerable communities. And then really looking at a comprehensive strategy for our work with our local agencies. And this is one area that we are still kind of struggling with, is that any plan that comes out from a state agency has to really take into consideration the unique characteristics of each individual jurisdiction because there are so many geologic differences. The rates of sea level rise in different areas are different. But we have local coastal plans that are implemented by local jurisdictions, but they're somewhat costly to be able to adopt and update land use plans to plan for sea level rise and inundation. So we have ports, major infrastructure, our water supply, similar to Broward County, all being threatened by climate change and sea level rise. And so I think one of the ways that we have to think about how do we move forward is how do we get resources to local jurisdictions to plan for this going forward? And how do we do this in a way that doesn't really look like, kind of this bureaucratic top-down approach? And so I think that applies both to local jurisdictions, but it also applies to communities and making sure that voices are heard. So before we implemented our EJ policy, for example, we met with over 100 different community groups. We had public information conversations with so many. And so I think it really is about communication, understanding that we all are connected as part of one human family, and that whatever impacts one of us is going to ultimately impact our neighbors. And so really kind of holding that as a fundamental truth is really critical.
Great. And Joyce.
Sure. Well, so, we have heard from communities about a lot of recommendations that they would like to give to local governments, in particular about how to center equity in government-related resilience funding. And there are 5 suggestions that we have. And of course, they're not perfect, and they're aiming to replace something that many think is perfect, but actually is also quite imperfect. So one is to provide technical support, planning, and resources to less resourced local governments to help them develop resilience project ideas into fundable concepts. But also, too, related to that, is to actually remove the requirement for grant applications in the first place, because that is, typically really separates the wealthy community from the poorer community, since putting together a grant application is a really heavy lift for most communities in the United States. So perhaps instead of having grant requirements, have allocations based upon number 3, something more closely related to like a targeted universalism. So these would be guidelines for grants or loan allocations that are based on exposure and vulnerability data, rather than on whether or not the person with the pen had a golden nib. 4th would be to adopt grant and loan guidelines that require government departments to engage, listen to, and cede power to lower resourced leaders. And there are ways to measure that. And that kind of requirement can come from the state to in counties to local governments and nonprofits, philanthropy across the board. And then 5, one that is, I think, really profoundly important from our view is that housing displacement is one of the largest climate risks that many BIPOC Americans face. Of course, food insecurity, energy intensity, other things are also profoundly important, but preventing housing displacement by requiring loan and grant recipients to anticipate and mitigate lower resource community displacement pressures, by requiring the insurance industry to step up as those who actually do have a duty to care, which is part of the insurance code, and especially to ensure that affordable housing is not the first thing sacrificed as local governments make decisions in a climate changed era. Those things, that's the 5th area that we see as really including equity in government-related resilience funding decisions.
Robin, I would love to turn to you, building off of that. I mean, you're working with communities, the epitome of housing displacement, an entire community or communities that need to relocate, that are a decade past, as you said, when they were supposed to have relocated. So you shared with us what is working, but what's not working? Why have those communities not been able to move, and what do they need in order to accomplish what it seems everyone has agreed for over a decade they need to be able to do?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm heartbroken and I'm really angry because the tribes have been advocating for what they need for decades. They've testified to Congress. President Obama came to Alaska because of their advocacy. And what President Obama and Congress have acknowledged we need is federal leadership on relocation. And as I said, relocation is awful, but that's the consequence for our failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone is not going to be able to stay on the coast. And it's unclear at this point. I mean, if we use what the current paradigm is, as everybody has said, it's going to be those with the most resources are going to be able to be protected, and those with the least resources are going to be forced to figure out where they're going to go. And so we've been advocating now for a long time for what, again, I mentioned as a relocation governance framework based in human rights, where tribes and local communities are determining the thresholds of habitability before there's displacement, so that they have the opportunity to make these decisions about where to go, how to go, and to get the resources that they need, and to also have the livelihoods in the places where they're going to go. It's extraordinarily complex and complicated, and it needs to be done. Because the federal government has failed to protect Indigenous communities in Alaska. And of course, as everybody knows, the climate crisis accelerates the inequities. So in many of the communities we work with, people do not have running water. In the pandemic, they have had no running water. There was just an article in our local newspaper this week because right in February, which is in the middle of our winter, it has been raining. And so a sewage lagoon where people put their raw sewage just leaked because it's been thawing, the permafrost is thawing. So these inequities have existed for a long time, and people, federal government, state government has not paid attention to it. And so we filed a complaint with the United Nations, with the UN Special Rapporteurs last year on behalf of 5 tribes in Alaska and Louisiana, saying that the US government is violating the human rights of these tribes by failing to provide the resources to protect them. And we are wanting President Biden to issue an official invitation to the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of the internally displaced, or the UN Special Rapporteur on racism, to come to the United States and do a fact-finding mission to document the human rights violations that are happening. Because with Congress and President Obama having recognized the need for this federal leadership on this issue, the time has passed. I mean, honestly, the time has passed for the leadership to happen, but for the tribes that are now at risk. But we still need that leadership so that they can make a future that they want to have in a place that maybe is not in their original location, but in a place where they can continue to harvest the traditional foods that they want and also be connected to their ancestral lands.
Mindful of time and of our audience of advocates, policymakers, regulators, Robin, I think maybe you've already made your case, but what is it? I mean, each of you are describing unique communities and unique efforts. What is it that regulators, policymakers, advocates can push for? Is it a framework? Is it a national climate information service to both support the communities where you're working directly and to enable communities across the country to do the work that they need to do in the way that it needs to be done? And Robin, we'll start with you. Is there, you've talked about a framework for human rights. Is there an additional ask?
Well, there is, so the heart of the work that we're doing with the laws that currently exist is to figure out how to decolonize them, because the laws that currently exist, like Joyce has mentioned, the FEMA laws, have been completely inequitable to the tribe. So in creating that relocation governance framework, we're looking to the laws, for instance, that govern FEMA, like the Stafford Act, and understanding what needs to happen in order to decolonize the systems that currently exist so the tribes can get access to those resources, and then create this whole other federal governance structure that is based, again, in human rights so that communities get access to the resources they need, are protected in the places they love for as long as they can be, until that time when they determine that it's no longer possible for them to stay where they are.
Joyce, I'll turn to you next. For an audience of advocates, regulators, policymakers, what's the ask? What needs to be done?
I think one of the major asks is to be sure that what we're talking about today is a part of every election cycle for every level of leader, because this is the humanitarian challenge of our time, and it's no longer okay to be supposedly representing the citizens of whatever jurisdiction one is elected to without acknowledging systemic racism, history of injustice, current injustice, and especially how climate change risks, current and future risks, make all of that worse. So I would say that anybody who is in a position of power to demand that our elected officials are addressing this, and that they are, for instance, changing how FEMA or how HUD or how EPA mets out their resources, how they listen, and making it no longer acceptable to perpetuate the systems that we have.
Thank you. Effie?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I feel similarly. I think that these groups, like in Los Angeles, we have the Los Angeles League of Conservation Voters that kind of raises funding to hold elected officials' feet to the fire when it comes to the environment. I think those things are important, but it also requires kind of this top-down and bottom-up approach where, the leaders of the state, like in our state in California, put forth these kind of overarching goals, and that we have requirements so that we have local jurisdictions to meet those goals. So in California, we have a 30 by 30 initiative to maintain 30% of California's open space by 2030. It's very similar to UN standards, protecting biodiversity with a focus on equity and inclusion. Those are important, but it's also important that we figure out how local jurisdictions receive resources to adequately implement those policies. So they're not just policies that sit on a shelf and that just collect dust. The other piece, I think, is capacity building for community-based organizations. Some of the questions in the chat focused on education and how do we educate communities and translate some of this information into kind of, regular kind of everyday speak so that folks are become more aware of what these issues are. And everybody wants clean air, clean water, a place to walk outside and enjoy the beautiful outdoors, but they may not be as educated on the scientific terms that folks bandy about. So how do we make those terms more accessible? But really important is building the capacity of community-based organizations to really help them find the solutions and to also implement some of these policy strategies and influence those as well, I think is really critical. And I think that's the only way to have that sustainability and cultural resilience over time is to approach it with that kind of multi-tiered outlook.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
Well, I think that in the Southeast Florida region, we've done, relatively well as far as we look at, local government initiatives, but, that's not enough. There is not enough of urgency as a whole as it relates to the scale of investment that's needed. Similar to other reports that were referenced, having this information for 10 years, we're within these narrow margins of failure of major infrastructure, and folks are not informed. They're not. It's hidden infrastructure. It is very hard to elevate these types of issues to compete with the day-to-day challenges. And so, community voice is pivotal. So clearly the community partnerships, I think they are largely absent in Broward County. They're just not, I'm not familiar with community-based organizations operating in my community like exists in Miami-Dade County and many other areas. And so that's clearly a really important voice that can connect much better at the local level than people like me. You also have the challenge of leadership coming together. And despite the urgency at the local level, the state has been very slow to react until recent years. And the tools are just, despite them being admirable, they're far from adequate. And then we're not really talking too much about the emissions issue, but where we can recognize that we've got these narrow margins of time for adaptation response, and we have even less time for making market changes on the emissions side. And so just coming in today, I heard more of the reports of people who are very involved becoming so exasperated because the evidence mounts, and the challenges are so Herculean, and while there's momentum, it's just nowhere near the scale needed. And I frankly think that the other folks here are far more positioned to talk about how we do those things better, but knowledge, better communication skills, full community engagement, and I don't know. Those are the things that I think are still needed.
Thank you. And I want to say sincerely thank you to each of our panelists and to our speakers today for a really meaningful as well as informative hour of conversation. And want to acknowledge Jennifer, well, each of you, right? The frustration, the exasperation, and the urgency that we all feel in dealing with this unfolding and ongoing emergency. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you for sharing your stories with us today. And I want to now turn it over to Christophe Courchain from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office to kind of help us process this 3-event series that hopefully many of you with us today have been with us for some of those previous events as well, and kind of think about some of the takeaways from these 3 really remarkable conversations that we've had.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to that absolutely outstanding panel of tremendous insights from all of these folks are doing this hard adaptation work with communities and with stakeholders, and it comes through just how challenging this is. And I'm really grateful for the time that all have spent with us today to share their insights. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Energy and Environment Bureau at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. And it was a great honor to help organize this entire webinar series. And there is so much more to this topic of climate risk than we had the time to talk about over these last 3 webinars. But we have learned a great deal. And I strongly encourage you to go back and look at those recordings of those events. The recording from this event will be posted as well, so that you can share it with your colleagues and community members. The series overall focused on the physical climate risks that will endanger our communities, our infrastructure, and our economy. And I think we heard a lot of that today. What we've heard across the panels is that climate change is already here. It's expensive, It's devastating. It's contributing to the inequities that we face, and it will get much worse. All those things are certainties at this point. It's not just about sea level rise at the coast, even though that's a big part of the story. It's about the melting permafrost we heard about today, destroying indigenous communities in Alaska. It's about the heat waves that are killing people every summer in cities around the world and making parts of the developing world, in fact, increasingly unsafe to work or live outdoors without artificial cooling. It's about the raging wildfires that are filling our lungs with soot. It's about the essential infrastructure that's failing, as we heard about repeatedly today, at astronomical cost. It's about the abandonment of homes after climate disasters. These are real things that are happening right now. And so my first real takeaway from this is that we all have to grapple with climate risk. And that goes far beyond the group that many of you on the call right now may be among them, who might think of themselves as climate people, climate aware professionals. We need you, of course, but we also need federal, state, local elected officials. Heard about the importance of elections today. We need the city planners. We need the human services providers, the community organizers, the labor unions, the chambers of commerce, the finance gurus, our utilities, our insurance companies and their regulators. We need the state retirement boards and the big banks, and we need taxpayers, consumers, voters, residents themselves. So this is an all hands on deck situation. And I guess the thing that really strikes me today is just how climate risk is a challenge to our social and economic systems, and they are all so profoundly interconnected. And I think that's a huge theme of the IPCC report out this week. So I'll just take a moment to share a couple reflections from that. Sonny, if you wouldn't mind throwing up the first slide. I think this is a graphic from the Summary for Policymakers. And if you look closely at that circle, these are equity and justice, inclusion, areas of engagement, things that we can do that move the needle in the right direction. This chart is showing sort of our futures and the possible ways they may go, with shocks represented by the lightning bolts, and the choices that we have to make as we move forward. And it really is striking how now the social science, as well as the physical science, is really demonstrating just how important the issues we talked about today, the interconnections of those issues need to be grappled with if we have a hope of reaching the top of the chart and aren't consigned to the bottom of the chart. Let's move to the next slide. I just wanted to put, this is the conclusion that Heather referenced earlier on. It is striking that scientists were willing to say this. And certainly if we go to the next slide, one thing that this slide talks about, this conclusion of the IPCC report, if you go down in this finding, you'll see that it talks about how non-climate challenges inhibit us from doing the things we need to do to address climate risk, and they are also further exacerbated by climate change. So it's inequality, prevents us from grappling with climate change, and climate change worsens inequality. It's not a virtuous cycle. So maybe the last slide. This is really the takeaway that I have in this component of my remarks, which is that all of us have to grapple with this, and we need to do it well. And I think what we've heard today is that some places have been doing it well, relatively well, and some places have been doing an atrocious job. And really, this finding in an IPCC report was just stunning to me, that it came from that august group of scientists who speak in very conservative, guarded terms. But I just would focus on there is evidence. There's an evidence base for everything we talked about today. Really, experience shows that climate resilient development processes, jargon for doing this well, are timely, anticipatory, integrative, flexible, and action focused. Common goals and social learning build adaptive capacity. And if we sort of look at the end, it's inclusive processes involving local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, as well as processes that coordinate risk across institutions. And so that, to me, is just an affirmation of why we were here today. I'm going to go quickly through my other takeaways, and we can take the slides off. I'll just say, we've learned climate risk is material during this session in every legal and economic sense of the word now. We certainly know that the infrastructure investments we're making today are long-lived. And if we make them wrong, that's called maladaptation. And they matter not just morally, but financially to individuals and communities. So we heard in one session that a major asset manager is making capital investment decisions right now using physical climate risk data. We heard from a state insurance regulator who's seeking to ensure that insurance companies today have a strategy for dealing with climate risk. That's huge, and it needs to happen everywhere. I'd say third, we have a third takeaway is we need strong legal requirements in public institutions. And that's really what I represent, I guess, a public institution that's trying to make these legal requirements real. That's why we have commenters clamoring at the SEC to get them to finalize climate risk disclosure standards. That's why the central banks of the world are making banks increasingly stress test their assets against climate scenarios. And that's why we have bedrock environmental laws, and they must be followed where we deal with new development projects or programs at the federal, state, and local level. All these things are going to address climate risk, and they need to be done using our federal environmental laws that we can vigorously enforce as attorneys in offices like mine. And we need to do that because really that actual decisions need to be influenced by this information that's developed around climate risk. We need to take it beyond the IPCC, to use the first panel. And we really need this information, finally, fourth, to come off the shelf and be used by communities. And in particular, we need to do much better at dealing getting this information into the hands of community-led efforts, especially in marginalized environmental justice communities. We need to direct investments to those places as well. I guess, to summarize, as Attorney General Healy said in the first webinar, and also came up today, climate risk information will do us no good on a shelf or if it only lives in fancy PDFs. Just as important, the information used incorrectly or inequitably will compound inequity. And in that sense, we need government, our academic community, civil society. Woodwell and others are endeavoring to do this, to step up and put this information thoughtfully into all hands. And so finally, I thank you all for your attention across these webinars, for your interest. Just a quick few thank yous to close us out. I'm really grateful for my colleague Meg Herzog's leadership and legwork. She couldn't be here today, but she helped conceptualize and put this webinar series together. Thanks to Heather Goldstone at Woodwell for her many roles as well, including today. She provided an amazing, enthusiastic moderatorship today. And also to Madison Condon at BU, professor of law there, helped put this series together. She's been doing some amazing scholarship in this exact area. And so let me also thank my wonderful friends at the State Impact Center, especially Bethany and Sony, who did all the hard work to coordinate this series. We could not have pulled it off without you and your organizing prowess and energy. And so we hope you'll be in touch with us in the future as we try to continue this conversation and get this information into the hands of people who can use it. So thank you all very much for your time today. And I guess I will turn it over back to Heather or Bethany.
Thanks, Christoph. I want to just close us out with another round of thank yous. Thank you to Senator Joe Kennedy, to Heather Mcteer Tooney, to Robin, Joyce, Jennifer, and Effie for sharing your experiences and insights today. Thank you also to Heather and Christoph and Meg for helping organize this. Thank you all for speaking as well. Recordings, for all of you out there, recordings of our 2 prior panels in this series are also available on our website and linked in the chat. I'll put that there in a second. And we really, please share those recordings, share this recording. We hope that this galvanizes you out there to get engaged and that you can use this data and support your community in addressing the risks that folks are facing right now. Thank you, everybody.